If you sign those papers, I'll walk away forever.
You think this is what I want?
Then tell me not to leave.
How can I ask you to stay? When my little brother is lying in a hospital bed because I couldn't save him without you?
Maren.
Do you know what it feels like? To choose between the only family you have and the only man you've ever loved?
You never had to choose.
I already did. I married you. For my brother.
My name is Maren Ellison, and everything I did began with one promise. I promised my mother I would protect my younger brother Callum, no matter what happened. She made me repeat those words while holding my hand in the hospital room 3 years before this story began. Even after the pain medicine made her voice weak, she still smiled at us the way mothers somehow do. She kissed Callum's forehead, then mine, and held on a little longer than she should have been able to. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was steady. "Family isn't what you're born into," she whispered, her eyes moving between us like she was memorizing us for a place she couldn't take us to. "It's what you choose to protect, even when it costs you everything." Before we go any further, tell us the city you're watching from in the comments. I always love seeing people join us from all over the world, and if you enjoy emotional stories that keep you hooked until the very end, make sure you subscribe, because we've got plenty more unforgettable stories waiting for you. I was 24 when she passed away. Callum was only 14. From that day forward, I stopped being just his sister. I became his guardian, his cheerleader, his cook, his tutor, his alarm clock, and sometimes the only reason he kept smiling. People always told me I had an old soul. I suppose grief ages you faster than birthdays ever could. I worked mornings at a neighborhood bakery in Portland, before spending afternoons designing wedding invitations for a small print studio. At night, I accepted freelance illustration jobs just to keep our apartment lights on. Every dollar had a destination before it even reached my account. Still, Callum never complained. He was the kind of boy who apologized whenever he needed new shoes because he knew how hard I worked. The kind who pretended he wasn't hungry if dinner looked too small. The kind who believed every birthday card I made for him was worth more than anything sold in a store. He deserved a childhood. Instead, he inherited my worries. Everything changed on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. His basketball coach called while I was frosting cupcakes. At first, I assumed he'd sprained an ankle during practice. Instead, he collapsed without anyone touching him. By the time I reached St. Vincent Medical Center, doctors had already surrounded him. I remember seeing him through the glass doors of the emergency bay, so small on that hospital bed, wires already attached to his chest, his face pale in a way I had never seen before. For a second, I couldn't breathe. Not because of the fear, but because I realized how fragile he really was. Hours later, a cardiologist invited me into a quiet consultation room. I will never forget the expression on her face. She wasn't trying to frighten me, she was trying to prepare me. Callum had an advanced congenital heart condition that had quietly worsened over the years. Without corrective surgery, he wouldn't survive. The operation was highly specialized. It needed to happen quickly. Even with insurance, the remaining costs were impossible for someone earning 2 modest paychecks. I remember staring at the estimate. The numbers looked unreal. I kept reading them over and over, as though they would magically shrink if I blinked enough times. They never did. For weeks I chased every possibility. Loans, crowdfunding, charities, extra shifts, selling my mother's jewelry, even our tiny apartment. Every door seemed to close just as hope reached for the handle. Then someone opened one I never expected. His name was Declan Pierce. Everyone in Portland knew who he was. Founder of Ashford Development Group, a businessman worth hundreds of millions. Magazine covers called him disciplined. Employees called him demanding. Reporters described him as emotionally distant. He rarely smiled in public, rarely attended social events, rarely explained himself. I only learned his name because the bakery received a catering order for a private corporate luncheon inside his headquarters. While delivering pastries, I accidentally collided with someone exiting an elevator. Coffee spilled across expensive marble floors. Papers scattered everywhere. I apologized so many times I lost count. The man crouched beside me. Instead of shouting, he quietly helped gather every page. His charcoal suit probably cost more than my yearly rent, yet he never once complained about the coffee soaking his sleeve. When I finally looked up, those calm gray eyes studied me with surprising patience. "It's only coffee," he said. "I've survived worse." 2 weeks later, his assistant called me. I honestly believed they wanted reimbursement for the ruined documents. Instead, they invited me to Ashford Tower. I almost declined. People like Declan Pierce didn't schedule meetings with women like me. When I entered his office, sunlight stretched across enormous windows overlooking the city. Everything inside looked carefully chosen, minimal, quiet, almost lonely. Declan stood beside the glass, hands inside his pockets. Without wasting time, he asked about my brother. I froze. I had never told him anything. He explained that after our first meeting, he recognized the hospital bracelet still wrapped around my wrist and discreetly asked his foundation director whether my family had applied for assistance. We had. Unfortunately, the foundation's annual medical budget had already been exhausted. I couldn't stop thinking about it, he admitted. Then he handed me a folder. Inside was a proposal. Not employment, not charity, a marriage contract, 1 year, publicly married, privately independent. He needed a wife, I needed money. In return, every medical expense for Callum would be paid immediately. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because my exhausted mind couldn't process what I was reading. Then I realized he wasn't joking. I asked him why. His answer surprised me. His late grandfather's will required him to be married before inheriting voting control of the family company. Without that control, board members planned to divide the business his grandfather had spent 5 decades building. He trusted no one willing to marry him for wealth. He trusted someone willing to marry only to save another life. There will be rules, he said calmly. You'll always have your freedom. No expectations beyond the agreement. When 1 year ends, we'll quietly divorce. Simple, clean, professional. At least, that's what he believed. I carried that folder home. All night I sat beside Callum's hospital bed watching machines breathe hope into the room. He woke just before sunrise. Still smiling, still worrying about me instead of himself. I'm sorry I'm making life hard, he whispered. That sentence broke something inside me. No 16-year-old should ever believe their existence is a burden. I held his hand tighter than I ever had before. You are not a burden, I told him, forcing my voice not to shake. You are the reason I'm still standing. By morning, I already knew my answer. I wasn't marrying Declan Pierce because I loved him. I wasn't marrying him because I wanted wealth. I married him because my brother deserved another chance to grow up. And if sacrificing my own future bought him tomorrow, then I would sign my name without looking back. The wedding lasted exactly 18 minutes. That's all it took for me to become Mrs. Maren Ashford. No choir, no flower girls, no lifelong friends cheering from polished wooden pews. Just a judge, 2 witnesses, Rowan's attorney, and the quiet scratching of a pen across paper that legally tied 2 strangers together. I remember staring at the gold wedding band resting on my finger, wondering how something so small could suddenly feel so heavy. Most brides spend months dreaming about their wedding day. Mine felt like signing another hospital consent form. I kept telling myself not to think about what I was losing. Instead, I thought about what Callum was gaining, another chance to live. If I had to carry the weight of that ring for a year to make that happen, then I would wear it without complaint. When we stepped outside, dozens of cameras were already waiting. Apparently, someone inside the courthouse had tipped off the media. Microphones appeared from every direction as reporters shouted questions neither of us intended to answer. They wanted to know where we had met, why Declan Pierce had secretly married an unknown illustrator instead of one of the socialites who constantly surrounded wealthy businessmen. They wanted smiles, they wanted romance, they wanted a fairy tale. Declan quietly placed one hand against the small of my back and guided me toward the waiting car without saying a single word. It wasn't an affectionate gesture. It was protective. Somehow, that made it more meaningful. The drive to Ashford Estate felt strangely silent. The mansion sat outside the city on several acres of towering pine trees and carefully maintained gardens that looked untouched by time. Everything about the property reflected Declan himself. Beautiful, organized, impressive, yet unbelievably quiet. Even the fountains seemed to whisper instead of sing. I had never imagined living somewhere with ceilings taller than my entire apartment building, but as I walked through those enormous rooms, I realized something unexpected. Luxury doesn't automatically feel like home. Sometimes it only makes loneliness echo louder. Before I could begin unpacking, Declan handed me another folder. For 1 second I thought he was giving me divorce papers already. Instead, it contained the rules of our agreement. We would occupy separate bedrooms, connected by a private sitting room. Neither of us would enter the other's personal space without permission. Public appearances would require us to behave as a married couple. Private lives would remain separate. My career would continue if I wished. My brother's medical expenses would be paid immediately. regardless of what happened between us. At the very bottom of the page was one final sentence written in Rowan's own handwriting. "You owe me nothing except honesty." I stared at those words much longer than I should have. The surgery was scheduled within 4 days. Declan personally transferred every payment before the hospital even requested confirmation. He never asked me to thank him. He never reminded me what it had cost him. On the morning of the operation, I arrived before sunrise and sat beside Callum until the nurses wheeled him toward the operating room. He smiled the same fearless smile he had worn since he was a child, but I could see the fear hiding behind it. Just before the doors closed, he squeezed my hand and whispered, "When this is over, you're finally going to start living your own life." I almost cried right there, because neither of us realized how much my life had already changed. The operation lasted nearly 9 hours. They were the longest 9 hours I have ever lived through. Every minute stretched into another lifetime. I walked the same hospital hallway so many times that I could have memorized every crack in the floor. Friends from the bakery texted constantly asking for updates. My phone battery died twice. My hope almost disappeared 3 times. Declan never interrupted my silence. He simply remained there in the waiting room beside me, occasionally handing me a fresh cup of coffee before mine became cold. We barely spoke. We didn't need to. Somehow his presence made the waiting feel less frightening. At one point, I caught him watching the hallway instead of his phone or paperwork. Not impatiently, not distractedly, just present. When I shifted in my seat, he immediately looked away, as if he had been caught doing something he shouldn't. But his coffee was already warm in his hand, already ready for me, before I even realized I needed it. Late that evening, the surgeon finally walked toward us with exhausted eyes and a gentle smile. The operation had been successful. Callum was expected to make a full recovery. I don't remember standing up. I don't remember crossing the room. I only remember bursting into tears before the doctor even finished speaking. Years of fear escaped all at once. My knees nearly gave way beneath me, until Declan instinctively caught my shoulders. It was the first time either of us had touched the other without thinking about the contract. Neither of us mentioned it afterward. But I noticed something I couldn't ignore. His hands didn't let go immediately. Not until he was sure I was steady. Over the following weeks, life settled into an unusual rhythm. Every morning I visited Callum before work. Every evening I returned to Ashford Estate. Declan left before sunrise most days, and often returned well after dark. We crossed paths over breakfast only occasionally. Whenever we did, our conversation stayed polite and brief. We spoke about Callum's recovery, board meetings, grocery deliveries, and the weather. Nothing personal, nothing dangerous. Exactly as the contract intended. Still, small things began slipping through the carefully built walls between us. One evening I noticed the kitchen staff had all gone home early because of a snowstorm. Declan was standing in front of the stove studying a cookbook as though it had personally offended him. He admitted, with complete seriousness, that he had absolutely no idea how to cook pasta. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the grocery bag I was carrying. The expression on his face suggested he hadn't expected laughter inside this enormous house. "You're telling me," I said between breaths, "you can negotiate multi-million-dollar contracts but not boil water?" He didn't answer immediately. He just looked at me for a moment too long, as if trying to understand why my laughter felt so easy. That night we ruined one pot of pasta, burned the garlic bread, and somehow ended up eating takeout pizza in the kitchen while wearing clothes worth more than my first car. At one point, Declan actually reached for a napkin and wiped a smear of sauce from the corner of my mouth before realizing what he was doing. His hand froze mid-air for half a second before he pulled away like it had burned him. Neither of us spoke about it, but the silence after felt different. As Callum grew stronger, he insisted on visiting the estate during his recovery. I worried he would feel uncomfortable among marble floors and priceless paintings. Instead, he immediately challenged Declan to a game of chess after discovering an antique board inside the library. I quietly watched from across the room as the two of them argued over strategies like brothers who had known each other for years. Callum laughed freely, leaning forward with too much confidence, while Declan leaned back in his chair with a calm focus I had never seen directed at anything that wasn't business. "You're moving like you're afraid of losing," Callum teased. Declan didn't look up. "I don't lose. That's not a strategy," Callum shot back. "It is when it works." For the first time, I saw something shift in Declan's expression. Not irritation, not superiority, something almost amused. And when Callum finally won a round, Declan actually smiled. A real smile, not the polite expression photographers captured at charity galas, but the kind that reached his eyes. It transformed his entire face. Callum noticed too. "You should do that more often," he said casually. Rowan's smile faded slightly, like he had been reminded it existed. But I didn't miss the way it lingered in the room afterward. In the evenings after that, I sometimes found Callum's chess pieces still arranged on the board long after he had left, as if Declan had been replaying the game alone. One rainy evening, after Callum had returned home and the estate had fallen quiet again, I wandered into the library searching for a novel. Instead, I found Declan asleep in an armchair with a file still resting across his chest. The fireplace cast a soft amber glow across the room, making the hard lines of his face seem unexpectedly peaceful. A framed photograph had slipped from the folder onto the floor. Without thinking, I picked it up. It showed a much younger Declan standing beside an elderly man whose smile looked remarkably familiar. His grandfather. Written on the back were only 6 words. "Build something worthy of your heart." I gently placed the photograph back exactly where I had found it. When I looked at Declan again, I no longer saw the billionaire everyone admired from a distance. I saw a man carrying responsibilities so heavy that he had forgotten how to set them down. And for the first time, I wondered what he had given up to become him. That night, lying awake in my room, I reminded myself why I was there. This was still a contract. 1 year, 12 months, 365 days. Then we would walk away like 2 strangers who had completed a business arrangement. I repeated those numbers until I finally fell asleep. What I didn't realize was that my heart had already begun counting something entirely different. It was measuring the distance between who Declan Pierce pretended to be and the man he became whenever no one else was watching. People often believe the hardest part of a contract marriage is pretending to love someone you barely know. They are wrong. The hardest part is realizing that somewhere along the way, pretending no longer feels like pretending. It happens quietly, a conversation that lasts a little longer than it should, a glance that lingers for a second too long, a silence that suddenly feels comforting instead of awkward. You don't notice your heart changing until one day it reacts before your mind has time to stop it. I wish I could tell you the exact moment I began falling in love with Declan Pierce. I can't. Love didn't arrive with fireworks. It arrived in ordinary moments that slowly became impossible to forget. 3 months passed after Callum's surgery, and for the first time in years, I watched him laugh without wondering if his heart could handle it. He was back at school, gaining strength every week, and making plans for a future he had almost lost. Every time I saw him running across a basketball court again, I silently thanked Declan. No matter what happened between us when the contract ended, no one could ever take away what he had given my brother. That debt wasn't written on paper. It was written inside my heart. Life inside Ashford Estate slowly stopped feeling unfamiliar. I learned which hallway caught the morning sunlight first. I discovered Declan preferred working in the library late at night instead of his office because the fireplace reminded him of his grandfather's study. I found out he hated extravagant parties, but attended every charity event because he believed wealth meant very little if it never improved someone else's life. The newspapers never reported those things. They preferred headlines about business acquisitions and billion-dollar negotiations. They never mentioned that Declan personally reviewed scholarship applications or quietly paid medical bills for families who never learned his name. One Saturday afternoon, I walked into the greenhouse carrying a basket of fresh herbs for dinner and found him kneeling beside a dying rosebush. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. He carefully trimmed away damaged branches with surprising patience before finally admitting that his grandfather planted every rose in the garden himself. After he passed away, Declan refused to replace a single one. Even the struggling plants deserved another chance before being given up on. I smiled without realizing what he had just revealed about himself. He wasn't talking about flowers anymore. He was talking about people. That evening we shared dinner on the terrace overlooking the gardens. The sunset painted the sky with warm shades of orange and crimson, while soft summer air carried the scent of lavender across the estate. For once, neither of us discussed business, schedules, or the contract. Instead, we talked about childhood memories. He admitted he had never learned how to ride a bicycle, because every hour of his youth had been planned around preparing him to inherit the family company. I laughed in disbelief until I realized he wasn't joking. The following weekend, I convinced him to try. Watching one of America's most respected businessmen wobble across an empty garden path while insisting he was perfectly balanced remains one of my favorite memories. When he finally managed to ride several yards without falling, he looked over his shoulder with the proud grin of a little boy. I laughed so hard that tears rolled down my face. He laughed too. Somewhere between those moments, Ashford Estate stopped feeling like a temporary address. It quietly became the first place that had truly felt like home since my mother died. Then everything shifted, but before it did, something happened that I will never forget. It began with a passing comment. I had mentioned, almost absent-mindedly, that I missed my mother's old art studio. It wasn't even a complaint, just a memory that slipped out while I was helping the staff organize storage rooms. My mother used to paint there for hours, sunlight spilling across the floor, music always playing too softly in the background. After she died, the space was sold off. I hadn't thought about it in years. Or at least, I thought I hadn't. 3 days later, I came back from a morning walk and found the east wing of the estate unusually quiet. The staff avoided my eyes. No one would tell me what was happening. When I finally pushed open the door at the end of the corridor, I stopped breathing. The room had been transformed. What used to be an unused, forgotten space had become a fully restored illustration studio. Large windows had been uncovered, letting in soft, natural light. A long wooden table stood in the center, already stocked with sketchbooks, paints, brushes, and charcoal pencils. Shelves had been installed along the walls, filled with supplies I hadn't even realized I still missed. Even the floor had been refinished into warm wood that reminded me painfully of my mother's old studio. For a moment, I couldn't move. I didn't hear him enter. I only realized Declan was there when he spoke behind me. I thought you deserved a place to dream again. I turned slowly. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't waiting for praise. He simply stood there, hands in his pockets, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. I noticed you looking at that old sketchbook the other day, he added quietly, and you said you missed it. My throat tightened. I didn't mean. I know, he said. Then, as if it cost him nothing at all, he stepped back toward the door. I'll leave you to it. And he left. No speech. No expectation. No demand for gratitude. Just a man who had rebuilt a piece of my past and given it back to me without asking for anything in return. I stood alone in that room for a long time, and for the first time, I understood something terrifying. Declan Pierce didn't just see me. He remembered me, then everything shifted. Her name was Celeste Winthrop. She arrived without warning one Monday morning in a sleek black car that stopped directly in front of the estate. Even before the front door opened, the household staff exchanged nervous glances. They knew who she was. I didn't. She walked inside as though every room already belonged to her. Elegant. Confident. Perfectly dressed in a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than my yearly salary at the bakery. She carried herself with the effortless confidence of someone accustomed to being welcomed wherever she went. The first thing she noticed was my wedding ring. The second thing she did was smile. It wasn't an unfriendly smile. It was the kind worn by someone who believed they had already won. You must be the temporary wife, she said pleasantly. I had never heard two ordinary words sound so insulting together. Before I could respond, Declan entered the foyer. For the first time since our wedding, I watched every trace of warmth disappear from his face. His posture straightened. His voice became formal. Celeste. She stepped forward, as though greeting an old friend. I've been trying to reach you. I've been busy, Declan answered. Her eyes drifted toward me again. I can see that. Only later did I learn the truth. Celeste wasn't simply an old acquaintance. She came from one of the country's wealthiest families. Their parents had spent years discussing a possible marriage between them, long before Declan inherited Ashford Development Group. The engagement had never become official, but everyone in their social circles assumed it eventually would, until I appeared. That afternoon, I accidentally overheard part of their conversation inside Rowan's office while bringing coffee upstairs. I would have helped you, Celeste said quietly. I never asked you to, Declan replied. You married a stranger. I made the decision that was right for me. And for the company? She asked. For both. There was something in his voice I had never heard before. Finality. Not anger. Not regret. Just certainty. I slipped away before they noticed me standing outside the door. But I didn't stay away for long. Later that evening, I found Celeste alone in the East Garden, standing near the newly restored studio wing. She looked different outside the polished world of boardrooms and galas. Less untouchable. More human. You've been looking at me like I'm your enemy, she said without turning. I don't know you, I replied carefully. She finally faced me. That's exactly the problem. A long silence passed between us. Then, surprisingly, she sighed. "I'm not here to hurt you, Maren." Hearing my name from her mouth made me uneasy. "I'm here because I understand what this looks like from the outside." I didn't respond. Celeste's gaze shifted toward the estate. "Declan doesn't make emotional decisions. He never has. Everything he does is calculated, strategic, and right now, you are the most unpredictable variable in his life." "That's not true," I said quietly. She studied me for a moment. Then her voice softened, almost reluctantly. "You seem like a good person, Maren. That's why I'm telling you this." My chest tightened. "The board will never accept you. Every headline, every rumor, every question about your marriage weakens him. You may not see it yet, but people like me, we do." I shook my head. "This isn't your place." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." A pause. Then she said something I didn't expect. "But I've known him long enough to know what happens when pressure builds around him. He shuts people out. He sacrifices what matters before anyone else can take it from him." Her eyes met mine directly. "If you really care about Declan," a faint, almost sad smile crossed her face. "If you really care about him," she continued, "you'll let him go before everything he's built falls apart." The words hit harder than I wanted them to. Not because I believed her, but because a small, dangerous part of me wondered if she was right. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of Celeste, but because of everything else. The studio, the bicycle ride, the way Declan had looked at me when he said I deserved a place to dream again. None of it felt like a contract anymore, and that was the most dangerous part of all. Because every day I fell deeper in love with my husband. The calendar kept moving closer to the date our marriage was supposed to end. What I didn't know was that someone else had already discovered the truth behind our relationship. And before long, the contract that had brought us together would become the very thing threatening to tear us apart forever. People often ask whether love can truly change a person. After everything I've lived through, I think they're asking the wrong question. Love doesn't always change who we are. Sometimes it simply reveals the version of ourselves that fear kept hidden. Looking back now, I realize Declan Pierce and I spent months believing we were protecting each other from disappointment. We built walls, followed rules, and counted the days until our contract would expire. Yet every quiet breakfast, every hospital visit, every laugh shared in the kitchen slowly erased those walls without either of us noticing. The greatest mistake we made wasn't falling in love. It was believing we still had time to admit it. The beginning of the end arrived on an ordinary Thursday morning. I was arranging fresh flowers in the dining room when Rowan's attorney requested an emergency meeting at Ashford Tower. His expression told me something was wrong long before he spoke. A confidential copy of our marriage agreement had been leaked to the media. Someone had anonymously delivered it to several news organizations overnight. Within an hour, every major television network and newspaper carried the same headline: Billionaire's marriage was only a business contract. They questioned Declan's integrity, accused him of deceiving shareholders, and claimed I had married for money. Reporters waited outside the estate before we even returned home. Microphones surrounded our car the moment the gates opened. They shouted questions that cut deeper than they realized. How much were you paid to marry him? Was any part of your marriage real? Are you both planning the divorce already? I had prepared myself for public attention when I signed the contract. I had never prepared myself for public humiliation. The following days became a nightmare. Social media exploded with opinions from people who had never met either of us. Some called me a gold digger. Others insisted Declan had manipulated a desperate young woman for business gain. Even companies connected to Ashford Development began expressing concern. Several board members demanded Declan step aside until the controversy settled. Investors questioned his judgment. Television commentators debated our marriage as though it were nothing more than entertainment. Through all of it, Declan never once blamed me. He accepted every interview alone, refusing to let cameras near me or Callum. When reporters approached my apartment, or the bakery where I once worked, his security team quietly redirected them before they could reach us. He carried every accusation himself. But what I didn't know then was that the real fracture wasn't public. It was happening inside the company. Late one evening, I overheard a conversation in the hallway outside Rowan's study. Two board members were speaking in low, urgent voices. "The shareholders are divided," one of them said. "If he doesn't distance himself from her, we remove him." "She's the liability," the other replied. "Not the contract, not the leak. Her." I stepped back before they could see me, and for the first time since this began, I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not fear, understanding. The next morning, Declan left before sunrise for another emergency meeting at Ashford Tower. He kissed Callum's forehead before leaving, but he barely looked at me, not because he didn't care, but because he was already carrying too much. By evening, I received a message from his assistant. The board has requested immediate separation discussions. Mr. Ashford will explain everything when he returns. He never came home that night. Instead, I saw it on the news. Declan Pierce had agreed to step back from daily operations of Ashford Development to stabilize the company during the ongoing controversy. The reporters called it a strategic decision, but I knew what it really was: a sacrifice. For the company, for the shareholders, for everything except me. And in that moment, I misunderstood everything. I told myself I had been naive, that I had confused gratitude for something deeper, that Declan hadn't chosen me at all. He had simply chosen responsibility over risk. And I was the risk. That night, I didn't wait for him to return. I packed quietly, not because I was angry, but because I couldn't stay somewhere I no longer belonged. I left a note on the kitchen counter. Only 3 words: "Thank you, M." Then I left Ashford Estate before sunrise. No guards stopped me. No one followed. Even the house seemed to understand I was no longer part of it. Declan realized I was gone 3 hours later. At first, he thought I had taken Callum for a walk. Then he noticed the silence. No footsteps in the hallway, no soft music from the kitchen, no voice calling his name, just absence. He checked Callum's room first. Empty. Panic doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives as stillness. He called my phone. It rang once, then went to voicemail. He called again, and again. By the 4th call, his hands were shaking. He drove back to the estate faster than he had ever driven in his life. The house was exactly as it had been the night before, except for one thing: me and Callum, gone. On the kitchen counter, he found the note. He read it once, then again, and then he understood what I had misunderstood. I thought he had chosen the company over me, but the truth was, he had been trying to protect both of us from being destroyed by it. He didn't call the board. He didn't call his assistant. He didn't call anyone in the company. He called me, again, and again, and again, until his voice broke. Then he did something he had never done before. He left Ashford Tower in the middle of a crisis, and started looking for me himself. He found me 2 days later, not through security, not through networks, but through Callum's hospital records. I was sitting in the waiting room when I heard his voice. Not angry, not commanding, just broken. Maren. I looked up, and for the first time I saw what I had missed. He wasn't choosing between me and the company. He was trying to survive losing both. He walked toward me slowly, as if afraid I would disappear again. "I didn't choose them over you," he said quietly. "I was trying to keep them from destroying you." I shook my head. "I heard them, Rowan. I heard what they said about me." His jaw tightened. "And I heard what they said about me too," he replied. "That I should let you go to save the company." He stepped closer. I didn't. Silence. Then, softer. "I just didn't know how to fight them without losing you in the process." That was the moment I realized the truth. We hadn't been on opposite sides. We had been standing in the same storm, facing away from each other. I whispered, "I thought you chose them." His voice cracked. "I thought I was losing you anyway." And for the first time since everything began, neither of us had a contract to hide behind. Only fear, and love, and the damage caused by misunderstanding. He didn't ask me to come back that day. He didn't try to fix it with words. Instead, he did something different. He stayed, for days, at the hospital, at Callum's bedside, at the small apartment I had moved into. He didn't bring lawyers. He didn't bring contracts. He brought himself. And slowly, I began to understand what I had run from. Not rejection, but a man who had been trying to hold everything together until it broke in his hands. The proposal didn't happen immediately. It came later, after the company stabilized, after the board stopped fighting him. After I stopped running, it happened in the one place neither of us had expected, the hospital garden, where everything had once begun. Declan didn't kneel right away. He just stood beside me for a long time, watching Callum laugh with a nurse nearby. Then he said quietly, "I don't want a contract anymore." I turned to him. He continued, "I don't want terms, or conditions, or protection clauses." A pause. "I just want you." He finally looked at me, not as a CEO, not as a man under pressure, but as someone who had already lost me once, and never wanted to survive it again. I spent so long trying to earn the right to keep you safe, he said. But I think I finally understand. I don't need to earn you. His hand trembled slightly as he reached into his pocket. Not with confidence, but with honesty. He opened a small velvet box. The ring inside was simple, unassuming, real. I'm not asking you to be part of a contract, he said. I'm asking you to let me spend the rest of my life proving I don't need one. A long silence passed between us, not empty, full, of everything we had almost lost, of everything we had misunderstood, of everything we were finally ready to choose correctly. Then he added, softer, and if you say no, I'll still stay. I just won't stop trying to deserve you. That was the moment everything inside me finally broke open. Not from pain, but from understanding. I stepped forward, slowly, and for the first time, I didn't run. I don't want a contract either, I whispered. His breath caught. I smiled through tears. But I do want you, not because I need you, because I choose you. This time, when he pulled me into his arms, there was no fear between us, only certainty. 6 months later, we held another wedding, a real one. The bakery where I had worked baked the cake. Callum walked me down the aisle because he insisted our mother would have wanted it that way. The doctors who saved his life sat in the front row. Every employee from Ashford Development was invited. Even the gardeners who had cared for Rowan's grandfather's roses attended. As I walked through the garden toward Rowan, I looked at the same rose bushes he had once refused to give up on. They were blooming more beautifully than ever. It made me smile, because in the end, those roses had been telling our story all along. Sometimes people only need someone willing to believe they are worth saving. I thought I sacrificed my future to save my little brother. Instead, I discovered that the greatest miracles don't always happen inside operating rooms. Sometimes they happen quietly, between two strangers who choose each other, long after the contract no longer asks them to. And every anniversary since then, Declan keeps the original marriage contract locked inside a wooden box in our library. Not because it reminds us of how our marriage began, but because it reminds us that the most extraordinary love stories don't always start with romance. Sometimes, they begin with sacrifice. And they become unforgettable because two ordinary hearts decide that love is worth choosing, every single day. Sometimes the greatest love stories don't begin with romance, they begin with sacrifice. If Maren's story touched your heart, let us know in the comments. Could you marry a complete stranger to save someone you love? We'd truly love to hear your answer. And if you enjoy emotional stories about love, sacrifice, second chances, and unforgettable endings, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. Until next time, take care of the people you love, because sometimes one decision can change an entire lifetime.